All right. Well, I'll continue to monitor our waiting room, but we'll go ahead and get started. That way we have enough time for the webinar. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Cassandra Johnson, and I'm a Senior Program Manager for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And you're here today to join us for our lovely webinar presented by our partners from NIJA, the National American Indian Court Judges Association. We have Nikki Brocart Campbell and Johanna Farmer, who are going to be presenting, and I'll let them do introductions. But before we get started, we just have a few housekeeping slides we always go over. Just our grant disclaimer to let you know that development of this presentation was supported by our lovely grant here, but the points of view or opinions expressed in the presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the official position or policies of OJJDP or the U.S. Department of Justice. And just a little bit about NCJFCJ. If you're not familiar with us, we are one of the oldest judicial membership organizations that are around. We have over 30,000 judges and professionals that we have served throughout our time here, as well as 4 million families have been affected by the work that we do here at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And here's some of our areas of focus. Those of you who are familiar with us know we do things around behavioral health, child sex trafficking, child welfare. And today we're focusing on tribal courts and ICWA, DEI and justice. These are just some of the areas in which we have focused on. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our lovely presenters. And I will let you guys know that if you want to ask questions, you can put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring as we can. I got permission from our presenters that we are allowed to answer them as we go through the presentation as well. And we will be recording and be sending this out to you guys afterwards. Take it over.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Nikki Borchardt Campbell, and I'm the Executive Director of the National American Indian Court Judges Association. And before we start the presentation, and before I tell you a little bit more about NIJA, I just wanted to bring it to our attention that today is a National Day of Remembrance. And we've also called this, our Orange Shirt Day, and that we wear orange in order to dedicate and remember those children and families who have been affected by the boarding school era, not only in the United States, but also in Canada. And so the National Day of Remembrance is dedicated to honoring those Indigenous children who were forcibly taken from their families and sent to boarding schools as part of the policy aimed at erasing Native cultures. So today is a day to really reflect on the trauma and the loss suffered by these children, their families, and our entire communities. So through remembrance, we acknowledge the resilience of Indigenous people and the importance of truth, healing, and justice in addressing this dark chapter in our history. So this day encourages reflection, reconciliation, and a commitment to protecting the rights and the culture of our future generation. So that being said, knowing that a lot of the work that we do at NIJA and the work that we do together with the National Council really addresses, the health and the welfare of our children and our families. And so in 2023, NCJFCJ and NIJA released a joint statement on boarding schools. And once the presentation gets going, once I find that statement, I'll go ahead and paste it in the chat right here. And you guys are welcome to read it and to learn more. And I really do suggest everyone on here, take a moment to really look at the underlying issues related to boarding schools and how it's affecting the work that we do today. And, it's really important because the long-standing history of that intergenerational trauma, what we know about epigenetics, what we know about how trauma is passed on from generation to generation, is really important when we're dealing with Native children and families. So that being said, I would just love to have a moment of silence to remember our children who are taken away from us too soon, and the children and those families who are affected by the forcible removal from those boarding school policies. All right, thank you all. And so in starting this presentation, we have always been so honored to be able to partner with National Council, only because this is a way for us to really come together to talk about, not only the issues that are underlying why we do what we do, how to appropriately identify interventions for our justice system involved children, families, and individuals. And we're able to put our heads together to come up with the best type of information and training possible. And so a little bit about NIJA moving forward. We are a 501c3 that was established in 1969 specifically to address a lot of the changing policies that and requirements that a lot of our tribal courts, number one, were that they needed to apply in their courts based on certain federal laws that were passed in the 1960s and 1970s. And throughout the years, our underlying goals and mission is related to justice system capacity building, supporting our tribal court judges first and foremost, and our justice system personnel. And we've also really expanded the work that we do into training and technical assistance as well. So we do a variety of trainings related to tribal courts. We provide ICWA training to our state court judges. And, we're also very, very proud of the tribal child welfare work that we do internally with our tribal courts. And that has just expanded into a little bit of everything. And knowing that, we want to make sure that we have innovative work and practices that we want to provide to not only our tribal court justice system workers and personnel, but also to our state court judges. And so here's a little bit more of everything that we have done. And that includes, serving as a national voice, working on some policy matters as well that affect not only tribal courts, but state courts as well. And, one of the things that we also really love to do is making sure that we provide networking and connections between our tribal and our state court judges as well. So moving on, I want to go ahead and pass this over to Johanna. But like we said, please feel free to, learn more about some of these underlying policies affecting our children and families. And I did just find mine and Joey's statement. So I'll go ahead and paste that into the chat. But while also, I'd love to know more about who's online as well as you're asking questions. The way Johanna and I like to do these trainings is to be pretty interactive. So, we know that webinars are a little bit more difficult to find engagement, but at any point, anytime, just please go ahead and, drop your name, your position, and then don't feel afraid to ask questions. We really like to engage with you as these trainings are going on. So again, good morning and thank you for having us. All right, Johanna.
Haumadakiapi chantewashteu napi chiyuzapi tayukshta imachiapi. I just said, hello, my relatives. I shake your hand with a good heart. Good Thinker Woman is my Lakota name. Johanna Farmer is my given English name. I'm an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe and a Lakota tribal member. I work as a program attorney at NIJA, and I'm so happy to be with you all this morning. Both of my grandparents are boarding school survivors, so it's good to be here today. Cassandra, can we go to the next slide, please? So today we just want you to understand the importance of holistic data collection for courts. And we'll go into what holistic means in a few slides. We want you to learn some of the best practices for creating culturally aligned metrics and explore methodologies and tools for holistic data collection in courts. Next slide. So what is data collection when we talk about it? So it's that process of gathering and measuring information on variables of interest in an established systematic fashion. So what I'd like you all to do is, if you are able to, in the chat, put in why you're collecting data, if you're collecting data at all. And like Nikki mentioned, we like to make this as interactive as possible. And since we have such a small group here today, it really allows us to address some of the things that you're seeing in your courts that you're working in.
you want to go to the next slide, Cassandra?
We have a few people in the chat. Do you want me to read them to you, Johanna?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have for continuous process improvement. Orlinda wrote reporting. We collect for grant purposes and questions by tribal council, trends in court cases, and those are a few.
Yeah. So why do we collect data? You all listed some of the reasons why you're collecting data, but it might be required for compliance or reporting, like Judge Pierce said. Could be for grant purposes, or maybe your tribal council or the other departments you work with are asking to receive funding. We collect data in order to write grants to receive funding. Many tribal courts are operating on 3 or more funding streams. And so data collection is important to receive funding for efficiency and effectiveness, accountability and transparency to show people what it is we're doing. Here's what we're doing. Here are the numbers that we have. For policy development, we can use data collection to see what policies we need to have in place, maybe what policies we need to change. Monitoring and evaluation, like Jennifer said, that continuous process improvement, making informed decisions. We can make informed decisions if we have the data. If we don't have the data, how are we going to make informed decisions? Improve outcomes including access to justice, individual well-being, community well-being, and to enhance, court services are ways that we are important that we are collecting data. And going back to that, making informed decisions, I had started a truancy diversion program with court. And one of the things we were seeing was it was taking a really long time to get referrals from law enforcement into the prosecutor's office. So one of the things we started doing was just tracking time. That was one of the things we were doing. And we saw that it was taking an average of 19 days for law enforcement to send the citation over to the prosecutor's office in order for the prosecutor's office to start the diversion program with a family. But if we weren't tracking that data point, we never would have known that there was a holdup in law enforcement, and that was kind of a stopping point. So being able to make that informed decision, part of that was collecting that data in the first place. Next slide. So we know there are a lot of limitations of existing data collection. Sometimes we have no data that's being collected, or maybe we're only collecting outputs. And we'll talk in the next slide about the difference between outputs and outcomes. We're collecting data that's important to others. So when we go back to maybe we're collecting it to receive grant funding or for grant reporting purposes, we might be collecting those things because it's required of us to collect those things, but maybe it's not important to us, those particular data points. Maybe it doesn't tell us what we need to know. Maybe we're just counting cases. And what does that tell us about the court process? Even when we talk about, case counts, we go back to, that doesn't really tell us how long maybe a case is taking, how much time it's taking. But maybe if we're counting hearings, the number of hearings we're having in the court, that's maybe a more valid data collection point for us than how many cases that we have. It doesn't come from a cultural perspective. A lot of the data that we're collecting in courts is very limited to, what's been important to funders in the past, because a lot of the funding courts receive is from the federal government. Next slide. So we talk now about those outputs versus outcomes. And I think both are important to collect, and both are important to collect for different reasons. But so we have an understanding as we move forward. An output describes the result of an activity that a court carries out, but that doesn't have a measurable impact on its clients or customers. So outputs are extrinsic. And then an outcome is the actual added value that results from the output for the targeted group. And outcomes are intrinsic, the things that change internally. So outcomes are the differences made by outputs. Next slide. So we go back to that holistic data collection. We wanted to provide you with kind of a definition of what holistic means. So it's parts of something that are interconnected and can be explained only by reference to the whole. So I think about from the Lakota perspective, and we'll talk about the Tawahi Initiative. And the word Tawahi comes from the Lakota word that means family, but it's not just family. It means the interconnectedness of all things and our responsibility to each other, to the environment, and to ourselves. So the word encompasses so much more than just that surface level family. So when we talk about holistic, we're looking at a bigger, broader picture. Many of you know when someone comes into court, it's not that charge that brings them in, it's a lot of other things that brought them into court. Next slide. So we talk about holistic data, we're looking at data around spirituality, data around culture, data around their social interactions, physical data. When we're able to make and track changes in these different areas, we're also providing individuals opportunities to not re-enter into our court system. So we think about child welfare. There are usually a lot of things going on in a child welfare case besides just the initial, maybe physical abuse. There may be issues around housing. There may be issues around substance abuse. And when we go to measuring culture, we see that people who are involved in their culture are often not involved in the court system. And so how do we bring people back into the culture and allow them opportunities to be engaged in their community in a cultural way? Next slide. So we're choosing indicators, especially around holistic. We're looking at collective indicators, meaning things that are not just individual, but family and community. We're looking at strength-based indicators because a lot of the indicators that we have are all around the negatives, the lack of, the gaps in. And especially when we think of Native people, we know all of the things that we face that are, diabetes, death rates, suicide rates, infant mortality rates. One example I give is Native Americans have the highest population of alcohol use. But what people don't often know is that Native Americans also have the highest abstinence from use of alcohol. But we don't talk about the abstinence of the use of alcohol. There's this focus on the use of alcohol. So how do we start to look at these strengths that exist in our community and measure those things to help build our communities? And then progressive in the sense that they build on each other, that change doesn't happen overnight, that it may be small steps that they're taking, and recognizing those small steps and the steps that can kind of build on each other. Next slide. So we're looking at creating culturally aligned metrics. One other thing is, how do we engage our community stakeholders? Surveys, focus groups, involving the community in creating culturally aligned metrics. Starting by identifying some core cultural values and priorities that exist within your community is one of the great ways to start. When I had went up and visited Tlingit Haida up in Alaska, they have their core values of Tlingit Haida people printed out and posted everywhere for everyone to see. These are our values as a culture and a community, and this is what we're aligning all of our work back to. So think about in your community, are there values that have existed already and you just need to identify them and pull them out? Define what meaningful outcomes are for your community. developing specific and measurable indicators, and then finding a way to incorporate traditional knowledge and practices. One of the things I'll talk about at the very end is, Western science is catching up to indigenous knowledge. So how do we bring up some of these traditional knowledge and practices that have existed in our community from time immemorial and bring them into the work that we're doing? It's unfortunate that for tribal courts, we've had to be legitimized, really reflect Western courts. But now Western courts are coming around and adopting indigenous practices because they work better for communities, because you're looking more holistically at an individual instead of just the charge that's bringing someone in front of your court. Next slide. So here are some culturally aligned metric examples. So family cohesion. So the number of family reunification or mediations that result in restored family harmony. Cultural participation. So the frequency of participation in cultural events and ceremonies. And then spiritual well-being, self-reported measures of spiritual health and connection to cultural practices. These are all examples of culturally aligned metrics. Next slide. So I'm going to give you an example of the Tawahi Outcomes Framework. So the Tawahi Initiative is an initiative from the Bureau of Indian Affairs that started out as both an increase in funding for social services in ICWA for all tribes that have a child welfare program, as well as a demonstration in 6 tribal communities across the country. And part of it was giving money to tribes and saying, instead of us telling you what we want you to do, can you tell us what you want us, what you want to do, and then give us the examples of what you want to measure and what's important to you. So instead of saying, okay, we see that there's funding around suicide, so we're going to apply for the suicide grant, and then the suicide grant says, you're going to use this curriculum and you're going to report on X, Y, and Z, and you're going to do A, B, and C for activities. So instead they said, here, we're going to give you money and you're going to identify the things in your community that you're facing. Then you're going to design programs or collaborations that are going to exist. And you're going to say, we're going to measure the number of times someone goes to ceremony, because that's what's important to us. So the Tawahi outcomes framework was designed by the 6 communities in conjunction with the Maori people of New Zealand, who have their own Tawahi type program in New Zealand, to say, hey, we're going to look at outcomes. And instead of tracking just outputs, we're going to look at the outcomes that are happening in our community and from a collective perspective. The next slide. So this is the logic model. So the outcomes at the tribal level are culturally integrated services, coordinated service delivery, self-determination, data-driven decision-making, self-directed funding, improved measures of success and reporting of progress, the sharing of knowledge and lesson learned, and then data sovereignty. And then the outcomes at the family level are that we want knowledgeable and empowered, culturally and spiritually connected, tribal members who are stewards of the environment and natural resources. They're economically secure, they have healthy lifestyles, they have nurturing relationships and connected families, they're able to participate in the community, and they have access to safe and equitable justice and social welfare systems. So then at the end of the day, the impact is that we'll have resilient, cohesive, healthy, and self-sufficient tribes and families. There'll be a revitalization of identity, language, and culture, and an improvement in tribal self-determination and self-autonomy. Next slide. So this is the outcome domains. So we're looking again at that individual level, but then it's radiating out, right? So we all understand that what we do on an individual level can impact our family, the family that lives with us, the family that we're around, the family we interact with. And then it also impacts at that wider level, the tribal level. And so when we talk about that logic model, you could measure each one of these going from the individual level and then coming out. Next slide. So just to give you really specifically, if we look at safe and equitable justice and social welfare systems, that's the outcome domain. The subdomains are appropriateness of relationships with the justice and social welfare systems, trusted and safe navigation, better transition to society, and then advocacy. And then some examples of outcomes that you would collect in this area of safe and equitable justice and social welfare systems are things like increased representation of children and parents in tribal dependency cases, improved equitable access to the justice system, increased feelings of being treated equally in tribal and state court, decreased criminal activity, increased support to access community services, increased support and advocacy, improved reentry into the community, and increased alternatives to incarceration. And these are just some examples that are in the framework. Next slide. Nope, you can go back, Cassandra. So this is culturally and spiritually connected. So this is another outcome domain. So then we're looking at identity and connection, knowledge of values and traditional customs, traditional and native language, engagement in cultural activity, and connected to culture and heritage. So this increased sense of identity, increased knowledge of traditional values, improved traditional language skills, increased participation in cultural activity, and then improved protection of indigenous knowledge. And that's where we talk about this kind of like intellectual property. Next slide. Then the other example I'm going to give you for culturally aligned metrics is from holistic defense. So one of NIJA's projects is around holistic defense. And holistic defense is the idea that someone is provided not with just criminal defense advocacy, but advocacy in all of the other areas that an individual comes into a public defender's office with. So next slide. So this is looking specifically at legal services indicators. So here are 4 indicators on the side: understanding the legal process, anxiety, self-efficacy, and agency. There's a definition provided, and then what data source you would look at for the indicator, and then notes being like, let's just look at understanding the legal process. So we have this definition: the extent to which clients understand the sequence of their case, the implication of the various potential case outcomes, and then their role at each stage in the process. The data source would be a survey or interview you're doing, and you would consider implementing that pre and post questionnaire to clients to understand the change over time of whether they understand that legal process. So if you were to do the questionnaire when they first enter into the system, they've never had any interaction with the legal system before, their understanding of the legal process might be fairly limited. And as time goes on, if what's important to us is that they understand the legal process, we want to see that that changes over time, right? That as we implement a post questionnaire, and maybe it's when their case closes, do we see that anything changed over time? Next slide. So when we're looking at methodologies and tools, so how are we going to collect this and what are we going to look at? So one thing I always say is utilize existing data and existing case management tools. You might already have data there that exists. So how are you utilizing that data, and what does the data tell you? So we'll go into an example later on, and I'll tell you how sometimes knowing what is collected and the process that leads into that data collection can kind of show you more than just the output of that data. And then your case management, if you have a case management system, you may have tools that already exist within your case management system that can help you to collect the data that you're looking for. So dashboards, statistical reporting, and annual reports. So for those of you that are receiving funding, if you're reporting every year or every 6 months, you're going to have some data already that you're collecting. Now, again, it may not be the most important data to you, but maybe it will tell you something about how you're moving along. looking at client and partner surveys and questionnaires. So not just you conducting surveys, but what are your collaborating partners collecting? And could it be of use to you? And then interviews, focus groups, data analytics tools, collaborative data sharing. So are you sharing data with someone else, or could you share data with someone else? And then creating unique IDs across data systems. So if you're doing data sharing, one of the things to think about is if you're tracking an individual, is there a way to track them through the process? When I think about working with a tribe, could you use their membership number to track an individual across all of the tribal departments or programs that they're participating in? So you can see changes when you're looking at individuals. And then also thinking about tracking long term, not just the short term. We see ever more that what's kind of being required is best practices, and some of it requires studies. And so tracking data long term can also be helpful in tribal communities. Again, a limitation is it can be really hard to track. Statistically, it can be really hard in tribal communities because we have such small populations, but still, doing that long-term tracking can be really important. Next slide. Training and capacity building. So data collectors, the people who are collecting the data, need to know how and why we're collecting the data. If we're not training someone into why or how we're collecting this data, they might just be thinking, this isn't important for me to do. Whereas if we explain to them, this is how we're going to collect the data, these are the points we're going to collect it at, and the reason why we're collecting this data is because we want to look at individuals holistically, and we want to see that we're making a change when they're coming into our court systems. And the only way we're able to do that is if we're collecting data on them. So providing training also for court staff on cultural competency and the importance of culturally aligned metrics. Encourage staff to understand and implement these metrics effectively. I think there's like a bell curve when it talks about change, where it's like you have your people that are your advocates and that are going to be all on board. And then you have people that'll kind of come along, and then they're the people that are kind of the behind, don't want to change. But as more people start to become your supporters and the advocates for the data you're collecting, the more you'll see that bell curve kind of change. But I think training and capacity building is one of the important pieces of data collection in order for you to get people to collect the data you're looking at and understanding why it's important that you are collecting that data. So enhancing the functionality and responsiveness of court. So we're looking at how do we make the data from data to decision making, right? Next slide. So did we do what we said we would do? So this is implementation of whatever it is that you're looking at doing. So if we look at child welfare as an example, did we provide GALs, guardian ad litems, to every child that came into our court system? So then we're implementing that, and then looking at the outputs data, we say, look, we had 50 kids that came into our court system, and we assigned 40 of them with guardian ad litems. That's output data, right? We have, I can't do the math. It's very Monday-y today. But the understanding is that we did it to 40%, right? Nearly all of them were provided with a guardian ad litem. So that's that output data. And then the outcomes data is, did we achieve what we set out to achieve? So going back to some of like those indicators, understanding the legal process, did we do things during the court process that help someone to understand the legal process? So that's that outcomes data. If that's the thing we're looking at doing, do we set out to achieve that? So does anyone have examples of things that they'd like to achieve in their court system that maybe they do or don't have outcomes data for? So if you're able to or would like to, please put in the chat things you'd like to achieve in your court. And then understanding that process behind the data may inform what the data means. And I'll talk about this more. I talked about it a little bit ago. But Cassandra, you want to go to the next slide? So this is the evidence-based problem-solving process applied to tribal holistic defense example. So as I said, we do the holistic tribal defense. You can go to the next slide, Cassandra. Thank you. So if you start up here on the top right in the assessment and problem formulation, that's kind of where you would start. So you'd identify your client and community needs related to the consequences of justice involvement. You design the intervention. So you engage partners in a collaborative design of the holistic defense project. And specifically when we're looking at holistic defense, it does require a lot of collaboration. So you would need to engage your partners, and then you would design your evaluation. So you'd identify the evaluation questions, the indicators, and the data collection procedures. So some of that we've already done. We talked about the indicators earlier that had been identified by the legal services organizations as important for them to collect. And then you would implement that intervention. So now that we've identified what indicators we want, let's start to implement that. So we'd provide that actual holistic services to clients. We collect the data on program implementation and also on the participation outcomes. And as that intervention is being implemented, we're collecting data, and then we're able to analyze that data. So analyzing the data to understand the strengths and then the areas for improvement. So what's doing really well and what do we maybe need to work on? And then we take that data and we use it for feedback and modification. So we make modifications either to the program, or is there data we've missed out on collecting that we need to collect now in response? So if we go back to the example of the truancy diversion program, we were collecting data on the timeframes. The time frame improved to 1 to 2 days, getting that referral from 19 days. And then once we had collected that data and we realized, okay, that was where the issue was, law enforcement improved their process to decrease the time that they were getting the citation to the prosecutor's office. We were able to modify what law enforcement was doing because we had the data to do it. They were able to modify the program, and then we didn't need to collect the data anymore because we already knew it was down as far as it could be to 1 to 2 days, and that was where we were aiming for. And so now we don't need to collect that data point anymore, but it was important for that feedback and modification. And then it's just a cycle, right? So assessment and problem formulation again, design intervention. Next slide.
Let's say we had somebody who put something of what they're working on.
Oh,
Did you want me to share
yeah.
that, Johanna?
Yeah.
Amy Pierce said, we are currently working on heat maps to track areas by county where certain types of crime occur, i.e. most cases of domestic violence or child abuse.
That's great. So measuring success and impact. So case management metrics, we may look at outcome metrics, user satisfaction, community impact metrics. So it looks like Judge Pierce, what she's saying is, they're tracking by certain types of crime. So now that they're tracking by crime, they can understand where more domestic violence or child abuse cases are happening, if they are happening in certain areas. And then they can start to understand why might certain counties have more of domestic violence or child abuse cases than other counties. And then as they move forward and starting to look at reducing domestic violence and child abuse cases in those areas, they're starting to track the outcomes of the changes that they're making in order to address those things. But that's a community impact metric, right? If you decrease domestic violence or child abuse in a whole county, that is impacting that whole community. Then if we're looking at efficiency metrics, how quickly are we doing something? Again, going back to timelines is one of the important ones, right? Like it's like, oh, I waited 12 months to have my guardianship case heard. So how efficient are we at processing cases? And then also measuring training and capacity building. I think sometimes we forget to measure those things. Like right now, all of you should mark that down. We've attended From Data to Decision Making webinar, capacity building for our tribal court. And those are things where you are easily able to measure success and impact. Next slide. So here's the Tawahi Outcomes Report example for measuring success and impact. So this is specifically looking at the ICWA program at the Pasquayaki tribe. And so this whole thing is the outcomes report, the entire thing. So it talks about at the very beginning what the program is, the activities that were done in the program, who the key stakeholders are. And then currently, BIA requires tribes to submit an Indian child welfare annual report. And then what we were doing with Tawahi was looking at different outcomes and proposed measures of success. So Cassandra, if you want to go to the next slide, we kind of like zoom in to the outcomes data. So some of these are outputs, right? So we did 30 assessments and home evaluations, 30 foster care licenses were issued, 20 homes were renovated, and 117 family trees were verified. A faster intervention happened. So the intervention time by the enrollment specialist in child welfare cases decreased from 10 days to 3 days. And I realize even 10 days sounds super fast in a child welfare case to be able to intervene. And then if we go back to the outcomes framework that we had mentioned before, the aspect of well-being that we were looking at was nurturing relationships and connected families, with a priority area being child welfare and safety. So taking the outputs of the annual report that we were doing from the BIA, there were some outcomes that we could see. So one was we're looking at our children reconnected with their families. So 90 children were reconnected with their families. So 76% of children in ICWA were either reunified with their parents or were placed in kinship placement. 20 of the children were reunited with their families. So that's the actual reunification rate. Children were placed in relative or Indian foster family placements, and then children in guardianship with relatives or Indian families. So those are all like, it's important for them to be reconnected with their families. So once they're removed, we want to make sure if they're not able to be with their parent, that they're able to be with a kinship placement or in their community. So with another Yaqui family in this scenario. Then another outcome was we want to show that families show increased engagement with support services. So 76% of the families were supported or engaged with tribal social services, and that was 100% engagement. So Cassandra, if you want to go back to the last slide for a second. So if you look up, and I know it's kind of hard to see, it might be a little small, but the total number of new ICWA notifications that the tribe had received was 395. The total number of ICWA cases eligible for action by the tribe was 76. So that means they were either enrolled or eligible for enrollment. And of those that were acted on, it was 100% of them were acted on. So if the child was eligible or enrolled, the tribe intervened. So what we know about the process of ICWA cases in Pascua Yaqui was the minute a family was identified as an ICWA family, they were assigned with an ICWA caseworker. So outside of the state having a caseworker, they were assigned with a tribal specific ICWA case manager. And knowing all of the work these ICWA case managers did gave us the knowledge to understand that every single one of those families was engaged with tribal social services because they were assigned a caseworker who was very hands-on with the work that they were doing. So Cassandra, if you want to go back to the next slide. So when we look at this number 2, showing family increased engagement with support services, we knew every single one of the families that we intervened on were assigned with a case manager who was required to make contact with the family, required to make contact with the child, required to participate, go into the home, participate in hearings. So we knew, because of the process behind the data, that this was increased engagement with support services. And then children are connected to their culture and tribe. So 90 children, or 76% of children, were connected to their tribes. And again, that's about having them placed in the community, have them placed with kinship. So when you, again, going back to, if you understand the process behind what's going on, you can look at something that originally was an output and understand how it's an outcome if you know the process behind it. So next slide. So like I had mentioned before, Western science is catching up to tribal wisdom. So we see things that wisdom in our tribal communities and our approaches to justice are being utilized every day now in Western court systems. When you talk about restorative justice, that's almost every tribal dispute resolution system that's existed from time immemorial was only restorative justice. And now we see that that's being adopted when you look at peacemaking, when you look at talking circles, all stem from indigenous communities and are being adopted in Western courts because they recognize that unhealed people come into the court system and they need to be healed in order to not recidivate back into our court system. The importance of relationships. When we talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act and we talk about kinship placements, we talk about reunification as those like priorities in ICWA, we understand there's an importance in relationships. And many of you, if you work in the child welfare field, you really have an understanding of how much a child loves their parent, no matter what it is that they did. And also in indigenous communities, there definitely is that importance of relationships, the importance of aunties and uncles and grandparents in lives. And, ICWA as the gold standard really is saying like there's this importance in relationships and science backs it up. And that, comes from tribal communities. We recognize that. And then the sovereignty of families, the ability for them to make decisions about themselves. And, we talk about some of the best practices that the council has come up with are all around the sovereignty of families. Parents still being involved in decision making about their children, even though they're not in their care anymore. It's really important. Next slide. Leave people better than you found them. And I think, with courts, people come in, lots of issues going on. If we're able to look at them holistically, are we able to leave them better than we found them? And the only way sometimes we're going to know is start to collect those data and then make decisions in order to improve how we're providing services or connecting them to services within the systems that we have. I think the next slide is just if anyone has any questions. We have about 8 minutes left.
Yeah, you guys can feel free to come off mute if you're not too shy, you can, or if you wanted to put it in the chat and I can read them out for you. Unless Nikki has something to add too. Someone said great job. Very good information. Thank you, Seth.
I think if
we have any.
anyone, yeah, if there's no more questions, I mean, we'd love to hear like what challenges you're facing around data collection, if there are ways we can support you. I know we have 2 additional webinars coming up around funding streams and around social worker turnover, but we would love to hear what additional like challenges that you're facing around data collection. If anyone feels comfortable sharing.
There's a question from Amy Pierce. Is there any type of data collection program you see that tribes are using most often?
I wouldn't say I see tribes using one more often. I think there's only a handful of like case management system that most tribes are using. We'd be happy to share some of those. Yeah. Odyssey, people use Right Track, people use Justware. So we have a list we can share with you about kind of the case management systems that we see that tribes are using, but there's really only a handful, I would say like 10 or so. And some tribes are still using like Excel spreadsheets and paper files that aren't doing anything
Yeah.
super technologically advanced.
Yeah. And also with some of the, the qualitative information, things with like, surveys and focus groups, you can easily collect some of those if you're looking for software and programs or trying to collect things anonymously. There are things like SurveyMonkey out there. You can create polls through Google Docs. And so it's just a combination of things that we've seen folks use. I mean, even for our own qualitative information, sometimes we will use a Google Doc just because it's free and it basically coordinates all of the responses and answers into something where we can, download it into a spreadsheet and then work on, whatever metrics we're receiving from those particular surveys. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a particular program or a giant software system. It's really just thinking, what are we trying to understand and what are we trying to collect? And so sometimes I think we do try to overcomplicate it, and so it's like really using what you have already and trying to figure out how you can either organize that, populate it to figure out the numbers and the information you want, or to look at some things that are just really straightforward that aren't necessarily data collection, deemed data collection, but it's just you want some more information.
I don't know, Judge Pierce knows because we talked about this when we were on site with them, was Pasquayaki was working at a data system that looked across all of the systems, not just justice, social, housing, education, all of the departments. Also, because when we talk about like self-efficacy and the sovereignty of families, is being able to have a family access their own data and information and their own family plan was like something that's like really important. Because what's important to us might not be important to them. I think if there are no other questions,
Do you want me to read it out loud?
Yeah.
For the tribes not using software programs and still using spreadsheets, is there a concern for accurate data once they do convert over to a software program? And do you see a lot of data being lost? Seems like even inputting the data for transfer would be tricky.
So it can be. So I give the example of Basquiat because they did, they hired, well, not even hired, an intern volunteered from the law school to come in and collect all of the ICWA information from the paper files in their attorney general's office. So they have assigned an ICWA attorney also to every case at Basquiat. So they have an ICWA attorney as well as an ICWA social worker who works in every case. So there were a ton of ICWA files, but like there was nothing in any case management system because the case management system for the tribe was only used for tribal cases and not for ICWA cases. So that intern came in and like put everything into spreadsheets because that's what they had at the time. I think even in case management systems, there's always a concern about accuracy of data because it's always being inputted by a human. So even in spreadsheets, that's bound to happen that there may be, inaccuracies. That's why if you're looking at data overall, are there those outliers? And then going and looking at that outlier and being like, was this an accurately inputted information from this one particular case? And again, that could be spreadsheets, or if you're looking at a case management system. They did convert all of that spreadsheet data into a database system once they had one. They didn't lose any of the data that they had collected, and then or lost any of that data. And of course, they still have the spreadsheet plus the case management system now. I think one of the concerns could be if all you're keeping is paper files and there's no electronic version of it. If something were to happen to where you're storing your cases, I mean, hopefully you're doing it in a manner that's like, fire safe and all of that stuff, that nothing would happen. But I've heard, of state courts who like, oh, we house it in the basement of this one building and the building flooded and then all of those cases were lost. So I think there's always concern if you're only keeping paper files, there's no electronic version. I mean, the opposite is also true. We're in a world where tribes, states, if you have anything online, your potential to get hacked is possible. So there's also the possibility of losing data, even if it's electronic. Thank you for the question. I think that's time for us. Cassandra, if you want to go to the last slide. We have our contact information here for Cassandra and for myself. If you have any questions, requests for training and technical assistance, we're here. We will share when we have the 2 additional webinars upcoming in the next few months. And we really appreciate all of your time today.
Yeah, thank you. We had one comment towards the end, but
if people want to,
if
people want to jump off, Erica, if you want to stay on, or happy to, have a discussion around your comment.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing. Thank you all.
So Pima County has struggled with reporting and collecting some desired ICWA metrics. For example, tracking tribal engagement at hearings is difficult because minute entries are so vague and only a small set of court employees have access to court recordings. We would like to track this to follow the ICWA gold standards, but don't have any way to effectively do that. I think understanding now that you like what it is you're trying to track, how do you engage with partners to come up with a way to track that? So you might have a way with individual tribes. They might be tracking who's attending their ICWA hearings. Or is there a way you could work with the courts to change how they're doing the minute entries in order to be able to track that engagement?
Yeah, that was going to be my suggestion on the court side with regard to minute entries. Like, even if it's something as simple as noting whether or not a tribal representative is there, that's seconds. into that particular entry. Let's see, tracking tribal engagement. I mean, I think that might be the most effective way for the court side of things. You know, beyond that, the other thing that I was thinking would probably, you know, maybe it's on the I hate calling it the qualitative side versus the quantitative side, but you know, just the capture of like through survey reporting of, you know, whether the tribe or the family involved was acknowledging, you know, that you know, there was some tribal engagement there was some support there, some tribal representation that, you know, the court could keep on the court side related to, but I don't know. Johanna, do you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, like I said, the asking the tribes themselves. So like I'm lucky because I know Pima County really, like, it's really familiar to me. I lived in Tucson for 16 years and I worked with the Pasquayaki tribe for 13 of those years. So you have a smaller sect of tribes that you're potentially interacting with. So pulling in Tohono O'odham, pulling in Pasquayaki, Navajo, and maybe you are engaging with those three particular tribes that maybe have the biggest population of in your courts, and asking them too, like, how are you measuring it on your tribal side, and is there a way of information sharing? I know there are a lot of projects going on in Arizona. Basquiat, I know, has an intergovernmental agreement with the state of Arizona, and so does Navajo. And so there might be data that's being tracked in another area that you're just, because maybe you're involved in the court side, you know, social services might be tracking something that you could get that data from them. I hope that's helpful.
She said thank you, and then someone asked if the organization has any example of survey questions. Maybe that's something we can send out to the participants if you guys do.
I think it depends on what it is. Like if there's something like really specific, Jennifer, that you're looking for survey question examples for, we definitely could pull together what we have.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excuse me. I think culturally sensitive questions to measure tribal engagement and the benefits that families have gotten from that have been difficult for us to come up with.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
We definitely can pull something together and send it over.
That would be really great. Yeah, we're really trying hard to come up with a data set that is helpful and measures the right things and helps us to improve our systems and measure what we're doing. So, and we really appreciate this webinar. Many of us came on because we were hoping it would be helpful to us, and I think there was a lot of helpful information.
Great. And I know, so I can share the Tawahi framework documents. There's a whole 7 set of documents. Specifically can share the Tawahi outcomes framework document. We can share the holistic defense example, so you can see the whole document that those slides, those charts had come from. We'll share both of those with people who have participated in the webinar, so you can have access to them. But if you have any questions at any point in time, like I said, our information is in the contact.
Yeah, and we can
Thank
send
you.
that all out to you guys. Yeah, we'll make sure within the next couple of days that anybody who participated will receive that. Awesome. Well, I think that was everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your
joining.
day and week.
Yes, day and week.
Thanks again.